No problem.
So like the purpose of this interview is I want to get some information about animal time perception. I've seen your TED talk and I like read your paper, and you seem very knowledgeable on the subject. So I'm hoping through this interview I can get a better understanding on like the how and the why animals perceive time the way they do. Okay.
Sure.
So let's just get first to the first question is, do animals experience time differently from us humans?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very clear, definite yes. So what we can do is, I suppose the first thing with the word perception, we can never really know what it's like to be another animal. There's the famous philosophy of, what's it like to be a bat? We can't really do that. But what we can do is look at the machinery that allow you to perceive the world. So while you never know what it is like to perceive time as a different animal, we can look at something like their eyes and go, well, how fast can it actually measure time? And that's where my study and lots of other studies come in. We can look at what's called critical flicker fusion, which is kind of like frame rate. So how many frames per second can your visual system basically record the world around you? And when you measure that across lots of different animals, you basically find the frame rate in humans is something around 60 hertz, so 60 frames per second. But in other animals, so vertebrates, the top end is around 140 frames per second in something like the pied flycatcher, right down to 2 frames per second in some in the scolar, which is a Arctic fish. So that's a huge difference. That's just in vertebrates. In inverts, we see differences from below 1 frame per second in starfish. So someone has measured that, right up to 300 frames per second plus in things like blowflies, dragonflies, and so on. So yeah, to answer your question, the way different animals perceive time is really, really huge variation. So yeah.
Okay, that's yeah, because I like how you said it's like frame rate. Is it like video game frame rate? Like when they say 60 FPS?
Sure, yeah, it's not that different from that. So yeah, so basically how you measure what's called a critical flicker fusion is, in the simplest form, is you get a light bulb and you turn it on and off, and then you increase, say you turn it on and off once a second, and you ask the observer, is this light flashing on and off, or do you just see a light bulb constantly on, right? And you would say, I can see that flashing on and off. And then you increase that flashing rate up to 10 times per second, 20 times per second. And you keep doing that until the observer says, I can't see a flashing light anymore. It's just on. So, for example, the room you're in, like you said, in computer games or whatever, the screen you're watching, that's got frames per second, but you don't see that flashing on and on. You just see a continuous motion. Well, in reality, it's actually a bunch of pictures just stacked on top of each other really, really quickly. So it's actually kind of very, very similar to that whole idea. And interestingly, actually, now I'll show my age a little bit, but like older TVs and stuff would have a frames of 60 frames per second or something around that. And that's not a coincidence. That actually kind of just happens to match our own critical flicker fusion, because there's no point in going higher. You can't perceive it any higher. It gets more complicated if you're a gamer yourself. You might be going, wait, don't gamers really want really, really high flicker fusion rates? Yeah, you might kind of capture certain small artifacts and things like that at higher things, but really after 60, it's very much a diminishing returns, let's say. But yeah.
So like 60 frames per second is like the human cap for time perception. We can't get any higher.
Well, you could get a little higher, not too much higher. There's some variation. Some people will naturally just see it a little higher than other people. So like any trait, there's a little variation. If you take certain drugs, that's going to increase. Amphetamines, basically. Basically, things that will up your metabolic rate will probably increase it just a little bit. Not a huge amount. There is probably limits around. I don't know for sure from a physiological point of view, but my guess would be above 75, you're probably not getting much higher. Now that's a guess. I don't know for sure.
Okay. Um, yeah, and I actually, you were mentioning metabolic rate. That brings me into my next question. What factors cause them to experience it differently?
Sure, yeah. So we've kind of known about this idea that different animals seem to perceive time at different rates, and the question kind of comes, why? Why doesn't everything just see really, really fast? Surely that's a good thing, right?
Mhm.
And the answer to that is seeing fast is expensive, like anything. Anything involved with your brain processing information typically is really expensive. So for humans, something like 20% of the energy we take in, our brain uses that. So it's a very, very expensive organ. And anything like that in evolution is a use it or lose it type of game, because basically, if you're using energy for having fast eyes or a big brain or whatever, it better be useful in either keeping you alive or reproducing more. Because if it's not, basically you would be better using that energy for something else, like just reproducing more and just kind of accepting that you're going to die. So what we kind of said is like, okay, only animals that would basically already have a high metabolic rate, because of two things: they have lots of energy ready to use that their eyes can use right there and then, and secondly, they can move fast, right? So if you've got a high metabolic rate, that means everything is moving fast. And then you can react to things. So there's no point having a really fast temporal perception, say really fast vision, if you can't do anything about it. It would be like playing computer games and having really high frame rates, but your character can't actually move to do anything, like, actually return fast enough. There's no point. So that's why we kind of tested that idea: is do we see really high frames per second or critical flicker fusion rates in species that have high metabolic rates. And that's exactly what we found. We also found smaller animals as well have a faster temporal perception, so faster vision. And that's the same idea. Metabolic rate and body size are kind of linked, but generally it's small things that can move fast, see fast too. Big things don't bother as much. Or species that have very slow lifestyles basically don't have as fast a vision as you would expect.
So like a cheetah, for example, will that have probably faster vision because even though it's bigger, it runs to hunt.
Sure. Unfortunately, we don't have data for cheetahs, which would be a really interesting species to get it for. But yeah, this is the other thing. So we find also is species that have, so for example, the pied flycatcher, that bird I mentioned, the highest vertebrate one, it's a flycatcher. So it's literally catching flies on the wing. So yes, it's a small animal, but it's much higher than you'd even expect for its body size, because it's basically a fighter jet and it needs to be able to update its information extremely quickly. So that's probably around the same size as something like a rat, but a rat has only got a temporal perception of something like 40 or 50. So there's huge differences even within. So even now, though we found body size and metabolic rate are predictors of how fast you see, there's a lot of variation. So different species can do lots of other different things. So an example actually of something big that has a faster temporal perception than you might expect is both a tuna and a swordfish. Really, really, really big fish. But tuna, it's up around 80 to 90 hertz or frames per second. And that's because, again, it's a pursuit predator. It's basically, it's actually called the cheetah of the oceans. That's kind of its nickname. So again, even though it's really big, it can move fast, it can react fast. And so it needs that vision to do that as well. So it's kind of a very general rule, this body size and metabolic rate thing. But it does seem to be there, but then there's all these other exceptions too.
Mhm. So you kind of already answered this. The pros and cons to them having different time perception.
Hello?
Oh, did we freeze? Oh no. Oh no no no. Hello? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Great. Yeah, it seemed to freeze there on you, so I'm not sure if it's my side or your side, but
Oh,
it does.
it might be mine. I am in I'm out of school, so probably that.
No problem. So I don't know what point to cut off on you. So did you get the last question? The answer for
Yeah, yeah. You were talking about the swordfish and the tuna.
Yeah, so it's just saying that even though they're really, really big animals, that they
Hmm.
have a really high temporal perception because of their ecology. They're basically the cheetahs of the ocean, where they move really, really quickly. And so even though they might be big, they've evolved this high temporal perception because it's very useful. And so it's not always big things have slow temporal perception and small things have high. There's lots of exceptions to that rule that we found.
So basically what you're saying, so it's not only like the size and their metabolic rate, but also their lifestyle.
Absolutely.
What they do with this
Sure.
species.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's
What
definitely the case.
what about brain complexity? Like how complex is their brain? Does that play a role?
I For our study, it probably doesn't get captured in how it's measured. And I would say no, actually. Temporal perception is probably a simple enough thing to do in terms of the complexity of like image formation, stuff like that, basic stuff. So, for example, the highest temporal perception are in things like flies and stuff with relatively simple brains. So it probably doesn't come into it more. Some, and again, we don't know, but something that might be more important is the type of eye structure you have. So compound eyes in flies, for example, where you've got a bunch of lenses, might be a little bit better at capturing temporal perception compared to our kind of our simple eyes. So that's probably more important than brain complexity. But no, that's not something we looked into, I'm saying.
Okay. My another next question is about the critical flicker fusion. You already told me like
Mm-hmm.
what is in your own words and like what it can tell us about animal time perception. But I want to know, where did I get the idea to use this? Like, was it already something established?
Yeah, yeah, it was a weird one. We were actually we were talking about whether time could be more than one dimensional. So silly coffee room chats, and we kind of very quickly, really talking to a physicist, very quickly realized the answer was no. It's one dimensional. That's it. But then we kind of were thinking about it was like, well, it's one dimensional, but like a river, can you sample it differently? So we were thinking about bats, for example. Bats see the world by using noise, and noise has wavelengths, which is all kind of very similar. You have a higher frequency call that has shorter wavelengths, so you can see the world faster. So you basically your time frames get closer and closer.
Mhm.
And then we kind of realized that people have been doing this measure of the critical flicker fusion for different reasons, often for reasons looking into animal welfare. So for example, in a lot of poultry, they look at flicker fusion so that they make sure the lighting isn't like a disco for the poor animals, which would stress them out no end. Other studies have been looking at it as a measure of like fatigue. So when you get very, very tired, your critical flicker fusion goes down, and it's actually kind of easy to measure often as well. So yeah, we kind of just fell upon it as a really useful way of testing our idea of, oh, do different animals first of all sample time differently, and so I'm a zoologist and an evolutionary background, and why do they sample it differently? So yeah, we kind of really just fell upon it, and it turns out loads of people have been measuring it since the 50s and even before that. So that was great because we were able to use all that data that's already been collected, because it's always collected in a few fairly standardized ways, and so we didn't have to go out and remeasure things. We had some data to work with from the start. So that's kind of why we ended up using it.
Mhm. Okay, that's cool. So like it was something that was already established that you realize, hey, we can use this to like measure how animals perceive time. Anybody have been using it to for animals, it's for poultry, for food.
Yeah, yeah, across the different studies, it's measured for all sorts of different reasons. So yeah, it was a really nice way of reusing data that had been, not necessarily measured for this reason, but perfectly the perfect measure for this kind of stuff, for these to answer the kind of questions we wanted to answer.
The puzzle pieces all fell into place.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
This brings me to my next question. You ever heard the saying like 1 year for us is like 7 years for a dog?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I don't. So I've been asked this question a lot about this, and I actually think that whole idea of perceiving how long a day is or a year and so on probably comes down more to memory formation and how novel your environment is. So if you're a kid, you're on a car journey and it's a 2 hour car journey. And it feels like forever. Um, well, now you'd be like a 2 hour journey, whatever. It's probably because of again that memory formation. Everything is so new, so it seems like that might be more important to how we perceive how long durations are, as opposed to this. I would look at this flicker fusion thing as more of kind of like how you instantaneously perceive right now, as opposed to that kind of longer term, how it feels over a longer term of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's more of a more like a memory thing. Let's say like how we like a long term thing, like experiencing like a lifespan is more of like a long time thing than a quick reaction.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
That's interesting. I never
Yeah.
thought about it like that.
Yeah. Our brains are very funny. Yeah. So like you don't live now. Your current experience of now is really like an average of part of it is like memory. So you know this room you're sitting in. You've probably been in it before. So your brain is a bit lazy and probably has filled in part just like I know this room and I'm gonna present parts of it as they are, right? So there's experiments showing that you could put a clock up and you almost see time differently because your brain is forgetting that the clock is ticking. So when you look at the clock, all of a sudden it ticks really quick. To kind of your brain is like, oh shit, that clock was ticking. It wasn't stationary. So that's kind of showing that a lot of the room around you is kind of just your brain making it up and using a best estimate of your past. And then over the last, like in a kind of more instantaneous thing, that's where the critical flicker fusion comes in, where for the kind of more quick moving things, that's where it's kind of like incorporating that. So your feeling of now is really an average of like over a second and then bits and pieces of the room filled over whenever memory goes back to. So yeah, so that's where I'm coming with the memory thing as well. It's your brain's complicated and there's no such thing as now. It's kind of you're always a little bit in the past. Yeah,
Funny. So
it,
that's kind of added on to how like the brain would prioritize um energy management, like saving energy. That's where we don't experience
exactly.
time. So it would get
Yeah.
like,
So
Photoshop things in.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if there's a shortcut to be had, your brain's probably going to do it. It's yeah, like you said, it's not going to spend energy when it doesn't need to. As and there's also evolution is so messy as well. So it'll have all these little tricks and stuff like that. But some of them don't work so well. Some of them do. It's the brain is a fantastically complex but messy thing.
Okay. This brings me to another question I talk about. The perception is, can periods of hyperactivity or inactivity temporarily change how they perceive time? Like, can they experience something like boredom or an adrenaline rush like we do?
Yeah, so like I said, the flicker fusion is probably it's not like 60 for humans. All like I said, there's some variation, and absolutely, it would seem that when you have flight or fight response, adrenaline rush, which all species would have probably some form of. Basically, what you're doing is you're releasing energy right now everywhere to just get moving, and what limits how fast you can see is basically in your eyes, your retinal cells. Photon hits a retinal cell, a cone, or a rod. It registers a photon hit me, and then it sends a signal. Then before it can send another signal saying the next event has happened, it needs to basically recharge itself, the cell itself. And it does that by, like any neuron, it needs to create a potential difference across the cell wall. So basically, and to do that, you basically, what it does is your neural cells have ATP pumps. So they basically just pump protons across the wall to create this differential in charge, so that when an event happens, it releases that charge, and that's the signal. All told, that means is your retinal cell gets a hit by photon, i.e. an event happens, and it sends a signal to your brain. Before it can send the next one, it needs to recharge. And the limiting factor on how fast it can do that is how much ATP is there, i.e. how much energy is there. So if you've got a high metabolic rate, or you basically just have an adrenaline rush or something like that, they can basically pump more protons across that cell wall more quickly. So your retinal cells are ready and recharged, ready to go again more quickly, and it can send a signal to your brain again more quickly. So really, it all comes down to the neurological part of it is how much energy is there, and are my neurons kind of set up to take advantage of that. So yeah, the answer is you an adrenaline rush, absolutely. You'll expect that flicker fusion to go up, and that's true of any animal. The boredom part, I wouldn't think it would be boredom. It's probably something more like fatigue. And there's some really again, it's not as simple as it seems. So if you do lots of exercise, then your flicker fusion kind of goes down if you're very fatigued. But you can kind of get these weird spikes and stuff like that across that. So it's a bit messier than just that. But in general, yeah, if you're really, really tired, then it will go down, probably.
Yeah, that's cool. So yeah, so basically like an energy bar in a video game. If you at the high energy, you can like your time can be boosted for a temporary. But if you're sick,
Yeah,
you
essentially, yeah.
like if you have COVID, probably went down for a bit. Oh, excuse me, I have a knock. Oh, sorry. Was so.
Yeah. So yeah, potentially that could happen. If you're sick, it could come down. If you're, yeah, unless you have a fever, then maybe it goes up. I don't know.
Thank you. I'm about to wrap. I have.
Sure.
So you were talking?
Yeah, so actually in one example so I mentioned the swordfish earlier, you're kind of asking about, so kind of go up and down. The most extreme example of that is the swordfish, where they have special tissue around their eyes. So swordfish have really large eyes, and it's literally it's called brown muscle tissue, and it's basically like muscle tissue that's very leaky, i.e. it heats up loads. It's very inefficient. But what it's doing is it's heating the eyeball up. So swordfish dive down quite deep, where it's kind of quite cold. And to get around that, because they're not endotherms like us, they basically heat up just their eye and brain tissue. And by heating that up, they're able to increase their flicker fusion rate from like something like 20 right up to 40 plus, allowing them to see faster pretty much than anything else in those kind of cold temperatures. So yeah, just as an example where you kind of asked, can it go up and down? Absolutely. And indeed, some species kind of have a whole system to allow for that, particularly swordfish.
Their like their habitat they evolved in their habitat to have this special time perception, to have this advanced time perception.
Yeah, absolutely. So they can basically turn it on and turn it up, and then kind of turn it down again when they don't need to use it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't think animals like it seemed like a lot of video game turns like flicker freezing. It seems so similar to frame rate.
Yeah, it is absolutely frame rate. That's what it is.
I have a few more questions to wrap up the interview.
Sure.
So the first one is, in what way can this knowledge of animal time perception change the way we study, train, and care for animals?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned before how some of that data came from poultry and it's really simple as while our world is based around 60 frames per second, kind of. So, for example, the light bulbs in your room that they probably have something like very high, like 200 or something. But for some species, like some birds that have a really really high one, they might be able to perceive some of that those flicking on and off of light fixtures and so on. So that's something you need to account for if you have a big farm. You don't want to your animals to get stressed out because if you imagine you sat in a room with a flickering light all day long, it will stress you out. So that's the most obvious thing to take into account. Other than that, it's kind of the reason we kind of did it was we were just interested in, yeah, how do other things see the world? And that was really it, to be honest. So I don't really have a great answer apart from yeah, we did it because it was interesting. And there's some, yeah.
That's a great. That's like the best answer. This.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just good to do something because it's cool.
So that actually answered my other question, like what inspired you to study this, but specifically like sensory. I seen the word sensory ecology, like
Sorry.
sensory ecology, like how
Yeah.
animals experience the world. Like what inspired you to like the research and stuff like this?
So what? Like I said, this is kind of one of those projects. I can't even remember exactly how we got onto it, but I do a lot of studies. I do what's called macroecology, and what I do a lot of the time is I look at different species and ask why are they different. Simple as that. So other studies I do is why do some things live longer than others? So you know what is it about the Greenland shark that allows it to live 500 years while you know some species only live one? So really that's my line of that's what I'm interested in. And so often, you know, it just happens, you kind of happen upon these questions. And this was definitely one of those cases where we talking to some colleagues that were interested in just that those kind of similar questions. We fell on it. Like I said, we were talking about silly stuff about whether time can be two-dimensional, real silly stuff. And that's where you those kind of conversations over coffee can lead you to these really interesting questions.
Mm, that's that's cool. So like with the TED talk, I do remember you saying something about the shark. So going back to how like is it a relatively big animal? Like
Yeah, Greenland sharks are pretty big. Yeah, yeah,
so
they're
with that same logic, like since it's bigger, and since it also lives so long that it probably doesn't need to use that much energy.
well, the Greenland shark for sure. We don't have that measure, but like it's not going out there to say that it's going to be very very low. Because their metabolic rate is way down there. Their ecology is super slow. How long? Again, these all things are tied together. So ectotherms, so like what's commonly called cold-blooded, which is scientifically great term, but it does kind of capture it. But those kind of species, if you're got a if you live in colder environments and you are very slow and everything else, then you tend to live longer. So your metabolic rate is very low. So in those species, yes, I would expect those larger things with low metabolic rates to have quite low flicker fusion rates. However, in endotherms, it's more complex because you can have like you know your metabolic rate is actually pretty high across the board. So and you have long-lived things. So bats, for example, can live 40 years despite being the size of a shrew. So that link between how long you live and your metabolic rate is kind of broken in endotherms a little bit. So I don't think it's really what the kind of thing you're asking, but it's quite in ectotherms it could be true that link.
Mm-hmm.
In endotherms, I'm not so sure. But their metabolic rates is just linked to so many things, including body size. So bigger things have lower metabolic rates, smaller things, but again, that's not always the rule. So it gets very complicated. Is kind of the answer.
Yeah, what I'm getting from this is that the brain is very complicated and it doesn't like to have a defined pattern.
Yeah, so well, there is that general rule, but it's a general rule, and there's exceptions to it. So evolution, it does that a lot, where you'll find it's typical. There is the laws of physics. So if you're big, it means you move slower, things like that. But evolution can often, if there's enough selection pressure, can often create these tricks and kind of avenues out of it to some degree. So there's always limits and so on. So yeah, and that's why biology is super interesting. It's not physics. Animals do all sorts of strange things and break all sorts of rules all the time.
Mm. Just so Defenders, do you have anything more to add? Anything more you want to add to this interview?
No, I don't think so, unless there was anything particular you felt I didn't cover for your studies or.
No, it's like you covered a lot more than I expected. I expected like the animal, like I didn't know about the bird.
Yeah,
Like to see the critical flicker fusion.
sure.
And also, I kind of like how you the coffee, how like most of these ideas just came up with toxic coffee. Like you just want
Yeah.
to know why. Like there wasn't no like some heartbreaking backstory. You
No.
just want to know why animals are different.
So just yeah, being interested in why things are different, a good cup of coffee and maybe a few beers, and away you go.
Yeah. Um, so I wanted to ask if I have any more questions. Do you think it'd be okay if I
Yeah.
contact you for any more?
Yeah, no problem. Just pop me an email and I'd be happy to help.
Thank you. This has been a great interview.
Great.
Um, and if I do have any more questions, I'll email you later.
No problem. No, I hope it was useful. Take it easy.
Bye. So this concludes my interview with Dr. Kevin Healy. It was really interesting. I liked, I think my favorite part, let's see, I think it was the critical flicker fusion and also the different animals like the shark, the swordfish. I found that very interesting. Like I can't believe it. Like the swordfish and the tuna, like how different animals can like through evolution basically cheat physics. Um, and I like I just like to know that animals all perceive time differently. Also, that this critical flicker fusion is like more instantaneous. Like what how can we perceive time right now? Um, and it's kind of different from that. Like it's like a short term thing. Whereas our memories and how we like our lifespan and how we overall like that one day is like a year for them. That whole idea is kind of more of a more personal thing. Like how like they say with a child example and versus an adult. So it we may maybe never know because like we can't be inside of an animal. So we don't know like that. We don't know like a dog's experience. Like I got this idea from a dog. Like we don't know how how they experience um psychologically, like emotionally. Like we don't know about that. We're not a dog. We don't know how a child dog feels. The time feels for them. We don't know. So it's pretty hard, but uh also, yeah, that energy plays a big part in time perception. That was cool. Like we can get boosted through adrenaline or we get slowed down through fatigue, but energy is the main factor in is seen to be a pretty big factor in how animals perceive time because we need energy to perceive time. Our eyes, our ears, like our brain needs energy to do it. And we seem to have a max cap, or animals seem to have like a seem to cap at a certain point because it doesn't become evolutionary, beneficial for them to see faster. Okay, um, so yeah, mhm. This was a it was a great interview. Thank you.